The Western Front. The rain fell in soft, persistent drops against the canvas of the Red Cross tent, each one a quiet drumbeat against the exhaustion that hung in the air like smoke. Somewhere beyond the tent flaps, the war still raged, distant artillery thunder rolling across the German countryside. The low rumble of trucks carrying supplies forward. The occasional crack of small arms fire echoing from villages not yet secured. But here, in this makeshift processing center just inside the newly liberated territory, there was an unnatural stillness. A pocket of silence carved out of chaos. Oberfeldwebel Marguerite Hoffmann sat on a wooden crate, her hands folded in her lap with the rigid discipline of someone who had spent years controlling every gesture, every expression. Her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform was torn at the shoulder, caked with mud that had dried into stiff patches. Her blonde hair, once pinned with military precision, hung loose around her face in damp strands. She was 31 years old. She looked 50. Around her, dozens of other German women waited in similar states of shock and exhaustion, Nachrichtenfeldern, communications auxiliaries who had been captured during the collapse of Wehrmacht defensive lines along the Ruhr pocket. Some wept quietly. Others stared at nothing, eyes glassed over with the particular emptiness that comes when everything you believed in crumbles in a single afternoon. Marguerite did not weep. She had wept when her brother was killed at Stalingrad. She had wept when Hamburg burned. She had nothing left for tears now that an American sergeant approached, clipboard in hand, his boots squelching in the mud. He was young, perhaps 23, with a square jaw and the easy confidence of someone who had never known what it meant to lose a war. He stopped in front of Marguerite, consulted his clipboard, and said something in English. She understood only fragments. Her English was limited to technical vocabulary from intercepted radio transmissions. Name? He repeated, this time in halting, textbook German. Marguerite Hoffmann, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Rank? Oberfeldwebel. Communications specialist. The sergeant made a notation. Then he gestured toward a line forming near a field kitchen that had been set up under a tarpaulin. Food, he said simply. You eat now. Marguerite shook her head. The thought of food made her stomach turn. She had eaten nothing but watery potato soup and black bread for 3 months. Before that, it had been turnips and ersatz coffee for so long she had forgotten what real coffee tasted like. But it wasn't hunger that made her refuse. It was something else. Something deeper. No, she said quietly. No, thank you. The sergeant frowned, confused. You need to eat, he insisted. Marguerite looked up at him then, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her voice emerged rough, edged with something between defiance and desperation. Bit. Ich habe schon genug verloren. She paused, searching for the German words that might make him understand. Please. I've already lost enough. Just let me be. The sergeant didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He glanced at the women around her, at the hollow eyes and trembling hands, and something in his expression shifted. He turned and called over a translator, a German-American private with a New York accent. Within moments, Marguerite found herself being led not to interrogation, not to a holding cell, but to that field kitchen where the smell of real food hung in the air like a forgotten dream. To understand what happened next, to truly grasp the seismic shift in Marguerite Hoffmann's understanding of the world, one must first understand what the Third Reich had taught its people about their enemies, particularly the Americans, from 1933 onward. Nazi propaganda had constructed an elaborate mythology about the United States. It was a nation of mongrels, they were told, a weak, degenerate society corrupted by Jewish influence and racial mixing. American men were soft, addicted to jazz and Hollywood frivolity, incapable of the iron discipline that defined the German soldier. American democracy was a sham, a plutocratic system where industrialists pulled the strings while the masses lived in poverty and ignorance. The photographs of Depression-era breadlines were circulated widely in German newspapers. Look, the caption said. Look at the great American democracy starving its own people while preaching freedom to the world. When America entered the war in December 1941, Joseph Goebbels intensified this narrative. American soldiers, he declared, were cowards who would crumble at the first taste of real combat. They were untested, inexperienced, pampered boys who had never known hardship. German newsreels showed captured American equipment with sneering commentary about its inferior quality. Radio broadcasts mocked American military leadership. The message was clear. When the Americans finally met the Wehrmacht in battle, they would break like waves against the Atlantic Wall. Marguerite had believed every word. She had been 18 when Hitler came to power. A bright student from a middle-class family in Munich. The daughter of a postal clerk and a schoolteacher. She had joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, because everyone did, because it seemed patriotic and right. She had learned to march in formation, to sing the songs of the fatherland, to believe in the greatness of the German people. When her older brother Franz enlisted in the Wehrmacht in 1939, she had been so proud she cried. By 1942, with Germany desperately short of manpower, the Luftwaffe began recruiting women as auxiliaries, Luftwaffenhelfern, to fill non-combat roles. Marguerite volunteered immediately. She was trained as a signals operator, learning to intercept and decode Allied radio transmissions at a listening post outside Frankfurt. The work was tedious, technical, and vital. She was good at it. She took pride in it. Every decoded message felt like a small victory for the Reich. But as the war progressed, the small victories became rarer. After Stalingrad, after Kursk, after the invasion of Normandy, the certainties began to crack. The Luftwaffe listening posts intercepted more and more American radio traffic, vast amounts of it, coordinated with a precision that contradicted everything they had been told about American incompetence. The equipment was not inferior. The soldiers were not cowards. And the supplies, God, the supplies. American units spoke casually about fuel and ammunition, as if they had infinite quantities. They complained about food being boring, not absent. They requested artillery support and received it within minutes. Still, Marguerite clung to what she had been taught. The Americans might have material advantage, but they lacked the spirit, the will, the ideological purity that made the German soldier superior. That was what mattered. That was what would decide the outcome. Then came April, 1945. The collapse happened faster than anyone anticipated. One moment, Marguerite's unit was dug in near a communications hub outside Paderborn, maintaining what fragile contact remained between scattered Wehrmacht units. The next moment, American tanks were rolling down the road, and officers were shouting contradictory orders, and someone was burning documents in a steel drum, and then silence. The order to surrender. The white flags appearing on buildings. The dazed realization that it was over. Marguerite and 17 other women from her signals unit were rounded up by elements of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. The American soldiers were professional, almost bored. They checked for weapons, confiscated identification papers, and herded the prisoners into trucks without ceremony. No brutality. No triumph. Just tired men doing a job. That was the first shock. The absence of violence. Marguerite had expected retaliation. German propaganda had been very specific about what Americans would do to captured German women. There would be assaults, humiliation, revenge for the stories that were beginning to emerge from the Eastern Front about what German soldiers had done in Russia. She had steeled herself for it, had mentally prepared for the worst. Instead, the Americans gave them blankets and told them to sit down. The second shock came at the processing center. It was chaos, hundreds of prisoners streaming in from multiple captured positions. A mix of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm old men, Hitler youth boys who looked barely 15, and scattered auxiliaries like Marguerite's unit. The Americans seemed almost overwhelmed by the sheer volume of surrenders. They moved through the crowds with clipboards, sorting, organizing, trying to separate SS personnel from regular army, officers from enlisted, combatants from support staff. And then there was the food. The smell hit Marguerite first. Real meat, real bread, the unmistakable aroma of fresh coffee. Her stomach clenched painfully. She hadn't eaten that morning. She hadn't eaten properly in months. The Wehrmacht rations had dwindled to almost nothing in the final weeks, and civilian supplies had vanished entirely. In the last village where her unit had been stationed, Children had begged for crusts of bread. Old women had boiled grass to make soup. But when the American sergeant directed her toward the field kitchen, something inside Marguerite rebelled. It felt like a trap. It felt like humiliation. To take food from the enemy, to accept charity from those she had spent years believing were inferior, seemed like a final, unbearable defeat. She had already lost her country, her purpose, the future she had been promised. She could not, would not, lose her dignity by accepting their pity. Bit, she had said. Ich habe schon genug verloren. Please. I've already lost enough. The translator who came over was Private Daniel Cohen from Brooklyn, a second-generation American whose grandparents had fled pogroms in Poland decades earlier. He listened to Marguerite's words, then turned to the sergeant and translated. She says she's lost enough already. She doesn't want to eat. The sergeant, his name was Tom Harrison, from Iowa. A farmer's son who had never imagined he would spend his 23rd birthday managing German prisoners in a muddy field in Westphalia, looked genuinely puzzled. Lost enough? What's that supposed to mean? Tell her nobody's taking anything from her. The food's free. She needs to eat. Cohen translated. Marguerite shook her head, her jaw set in stubborn refusal. Tell him I understand, she said in German. But I don't want American charity. I don't want anything from you. Just process me. Send me wherever you're sending prisoners, and leave me alone. Cohen translated again, more slowly this time, trying to capture the emotion behind the words. Harrison scratched his head, then sighed. Look, he said, I don't care about politics. I don't care about who started what or who's to blame for this whole goddamn mess. What I care about is that we've got orders to feed prisoners, and she looks like she hasn't eaten in a week. So tell her this isn't charity. Tell her it's the Geneva Convention. Tell her it's just what we do. And tell her that if she doesn't eat, she's going to pass out. And then we'll have to carry her to the medical tent. And that's going to be a lot more embarrassing for everyone. Cohen translated, adding his own editorial commentary. He's serious, ma'am. These guys actually follow the rules. They're not going to hurt you. They're just going to keep insisting you eat until you do. Marguerite looked at the two Americans, the sergeant with his mud-stained uniform and tired eyes, the translator with his Brooklyn accent and patient expression, and something in her resolve wavered. She had expected cruelty. She had prepared for hatred. But this casual, bureaucratic kindness was something she had no defenses against. Fine, she whispered. I'll eat. The walk to the field kitchen felt like a mile, though it was no more than 30 yards. Other prisoners had already formed a line, holding tin plates and cups that the Americans had distributed. Most were men Wehrmacht soldiers with hollow cheeks and thousand-yard stares, too exhausted to feel anything beyond relief that they had survived. A few other women from auxiliary units stood together, whispering nervously. Marguerite took a plate when it was offered. The American serving the food, a heavy-set corporal with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, didn't ask questions. He just ladled stew onto her plate with mechanical efficiency, added 2 slices of white bread, and gestured toward a table stacked with canteen cups of coffee, real coffee. Not the acorn and chicory substitute the Reich had been producing for years. Real American coffee. Marguerite found a spot away from the others and sat down on a crate. She looked at the plate in her lap. The stew was thick, full of actual chunks of beef and potatoes and carrots. The bread was soft, not the dense, sawdust-laced Kommissbrot that had been Wehrmacht's standard issue. Steam rose from the coffee, carrying with it the rich, dark smell of something she had nearly forgotten existed. She picked up the spoon and took a small bite. The taste exploded across her tongue, salt and fat and flavor. Real flavor, the kind that came from meat that wasn't horse or mystery canned goods labeled suitable for Wehrmacht use. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. Hunger, overwhelming pride. She took another bite, then another. And then she was eating rapidly, mechanically, shoveling food into her mouth with the desperate intensity of someone who has been starving without fully realizing it. Around her, other prisoners were doing the same. Men who moments before had worn the stoic mask of defeated soldiers now wept openly as they ate. An elderly Volkssturm man held a piece of white bread in trembling hands as if it were sacred. A teenage Hitler Youth boy devoured his stew and immediately got back in line for seconds, and the Americans let him. They just gave him more. Marguerite finished her plate and sat in stunned silence, the empty tin resting in her lap. Her stomach, unused to real food, cramped and protested. She felt sick and satisfied and confused all at once. She looked around the camp, really looked, seeing details her shock had obscured before. The American trucks lined up in neat rows, dozens of them, all functional, all well-maintained. The mountains of supplies crates stacked 10 feet high, tarpaulin-covered piles that seemed to stretch endlessly. The field kitchen itself, efficiently organized, with more food being prepared, even as the current batch was served. The soldiers moving through the camp with the casual confidence of men who never worried about supply shortages, who never hoarded rations, who discarded half-full cigarette packs without a second thought that it was abundance. Staggering, incomprehensible abundance. And it wasn't special treatment for captured prisoners. This was just normal. This was how the American army operated, even here, in enemy territory, in the chaotic final weeks of a world war. They fed their enemies as a matter of routine, not propaganda, not performance, but simple policy. Marguerite thought about the German rations that had been cut month after month, year after year. She thought about the turnip winter of 1917 that her mother had spoken of, and how it seemed to be repeating itself 30 years later. She thought about the Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front who had starved to death at Stalingrad, who had resorted to eating their horses, their belts, anything to survive. She thought about Goebbels' speeches about German strength and American weakness, about Aryan superiority and democratic degeneracy, and she thought, they lied to us. About everything. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. Standards that the United States took seriously, even when other nations did not. American military doctrine emphasized that proper treatment of POWs served multiple purposes. It encouraged enemy surrenders, maintained moral high ground, and set expectations for how American prisoners should be treated in return. By April 1945, the U.S. Army was managing hundreds of thousands of German POWs across Europe. And despite the logistical challenges, feeding them adequately was considered non-negotiable. The contrast with German treatment of prisoners was stark and well documented. On the Eastern Front, Soviet POWs received starvation rations as a matter of deliberate policy. Of the approximately 3.3 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, nearly 2 million died in captivity, most from hunger and disease. The Western Allies fared somewhat better, but even they faced significant privation in German camps, particularly as the Reich's food situation deteriorated. The International Committee of the Red Cross documented consistent violations of Geneva Convention standards in German POW camps from 1942 onward. But American POW camps, both in the United States and in Europe, operated differently. German prisoners held in camps across the American South and Midwest ate roughly the same rations as American soldiers, approximately 3,500 calories per day. They received meat, fresh vegetables, bread, and dairy products. Some camps even allowed prisoners to cultivate gardens. German POWs in the United States gained an average of 10 pounds during captivity. Many later described their time in American camps as the best-fed period of their lives, including their pre-war years in Depression-era Germany. This wasn't altruism. It was systematic, bureaucratic efficiency combined with genuine belief in certain principles. The American military machine, built on the industrial might of a nation that had never suffered invasion or sustained bombing, operated from a position of such surplus that feeding prisoners adequately didn't require sacrifice. It was simply an administrative task. Like maintaining vehicles or distributing mail. For someone like Marguerite Hoffman, raised on Nazi propaganda about American decadence and weakness, this reality was utterly incomprehensible. The Americans weren't supposed to be organized. They weren't supposed to be disciplined. They certainly weren't supposed to be generous, especially not to enemy soldiers who had spent years trying to kill them. Yet here she sat, her stomach full for the first time in months, surrounded by evidence that contradicted every certainty she had held for the past 12 years. Over the next 3 days, as American military bureaucracy slowly processed the captured personnel, Marguerite observed. She couldn't help herself. Years of training as a signals intelligence specialist had taught her to notice patterns, to gather data, to analyze what she saw. And what she saw challenged everything. The Americans wasted food. Not out of cruelty or shortage, but because they had so much they could afford to waste. She watched soldiers dump half-eaten meals into garbage barrels without a second thought. She saw crates of supplies opened, partially used, and abandoned when units moved forward. In Germany, such behavior would have been criminal. Every scrap of food was precious, rationed, accounted for. Here, it meant nothing. The American soldiers were informal, almost chaotically so. They called officers by first names when no senior brass was around. They complained openly about orders, about the food being boring, about wanting to go home. In the Wehrmacht, such behavior would have resulted in immediate discipline, possibly court-martial. Here, it seemed to be tolerated, even expected. These soldiers had none of the rigid, heel-clicking precision that German propaganda had mocked as the only form of real military discipline. Yet their army had crushed the Wehrmacht in less than a year of fighting. On the Western Front, the racial composition shocked her. She saw black soldiers working alongside white ones, driving trucks, manning checkpoints, performing the same duties. Nazi ideology had taught that racial mixing weakened nations, that the mongrel Americans would be torn apart by their internal contradictions. Yet these men seemed to work together effectively, bound by something other than blood purity, perhaps citizenship, perhaps just shared experience. It wasn't perfect. Even in her limited observation, Marguerite noticed that black soldiers often handled support roles rather than combat positions. But they were there, uniformed, armed, treated as soldiers. In the Wehrmacht, such a thing would have been unthinkable, but it was the little kindnesses that truly unsettled her. On the second day, an American medic noticed that one of the German women had infected blisters on her feet. He treated them without being asked, using antiseptic and clean bandages from seemingly unlimited medical supplies, chatting pleasantly in broken German while he worked. He didn't ask her name or whether she had family in the SS. He just treated her blisters and moved on. Private Cohen, the translator, spent his off-duty time teaching basic English phrases to prisoners who wanted to learn. He told stories about Brooklyn, about baseball, about his grandmother's cooking. He asked Marguerite about her life before the war, about what Munich was like, about whether she had siblings. When she mentioned her brother's death at Stalingrad, he offered genuine condolences. "War's a bastard," he said simply. "Takes good people and grinds them up for politics. I'm sorry about your brother." It was the casualness of his sympathy that struck her, not performative, not propaganda, just human recognition of loss. In the Reich, grief had been weaponized, turned into patriotic fuel for continued sacrifice. Here, this American Jew whose people had been targeted by her government just acknowledged that loss was loss, regardless of uniform. On the third day, a package arrived from the Red Cross, chocolates and cigarettes for distribution to prisoners. Real chocolate, not the ersatz cocoa mixtures Germany had been producing. American cigarettes with smooth tobacco, not the harsh, throat-scraping German brands. The Americans distributed them without ceremony, without demands for gratitude or loyalty oaths. Just, "Here, these are for you." Marguerite held the chocolate bar, Arcee's bar. She would learn later, though the name meant nothing to her then, and stared at it as if it were a bomb. She hadn't tasted real chocolate since before the war. Chocolate had become a luxury reserved for high party officials, unavailable to ordinary citizens regardless of their loyalty or service. Yet here were the Americans, giving it freely to prisoners, to enemies, to people who had spent years fighting against them. She unwrapped it slowly and took a small bite. The sweetness was almost painful, a forgotten pleasure that brought tears to her eyes. Around her, other prisoners savored their own portions with similar reverence. An old Wehrmacht sergeant actually laughed a genuine, surprised laugh, as if he had forgotten such simple joys existed. That night, lying on a cot in the women's tent, Marguerite stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to process what she had experienced. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These Americans were supposed to be the enemy, the degenerate democracy, the racially impure nation that threatened German destiny. Yet they had shown more humanity in 3 days than she had seen from her own government in 3 years. The chocolate wrapper lay on the small shelf beside her cot. A brown and silver piece of paper that somehow represented something larger than itself. It was evidence. Proof that what she had been taught was false. The Americans weren't weak. They weren't cruel. They weren't inferior. They were just people. People from a system that, whatever its flaws, had produced enough abundance to feed its enemies. Enough confidence to treat prisoners with dignity. Enough security to allow soldiers to complain without fear. What else was a lie? She wondered. What other truths did they hide from us? The systematic deception of the German population by Nazi propaganda was one of the most comprehensive information control campaigns in modern history. Joseph Goebbels understood that maintaining morale required not just promoting Nazi ideology but also carefully managing perceptions of the enemy. From 1939 onward, the propaganda ministry ensured that German civilians and soldiers received a curated version of reality. One that emphasized Axis strength and Allied weakness while concealing or minimizing German defeats. The technique was multi-layered. Early in the war, when Germany was winning, propaganda focused on showcasing military victories while portraying enemies as subhuman or weak. The fall of France in 1940 was presented as proof of German superiority. British resistance was mocked as futile stubbornness. Soviet soldiers were depicted as Asiatic hordes, inferior to disciplined Aryans. When America entered the war, Goebbels faced a challenge: how to explain this massive new enemy without demoralizing the population. His solution was to ridicule American military capability while emphasizing its supposed racial and moral corruption. American soldiers, Germans were told, were soft products of a luxurious society, incapable of enduring real hardship. Yes, America had industrial might, but industry without martial spirit meant nothing. Yes, Americans had supplies, but supplies couldn't compensate for lack of will. The newsreels showed captured American equipment and mocked its quality. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with American POWs, heavily edited or fabricated, who allegedly expressed disillusionment with their own country. As the war turned against Germany, the propaganda became more desperate. Defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals. Catastrophic losses were minimized or omitted entirely from news reports. The destruction of German cities by Allied bombing was acknowledged but portrayed as terror attacks on civilians, proof of Allied barbarism rather than German vulnerability. Goebbels increasingly emphasized miracle weapons, the V1, the V2, the jet fighters that would turn the tide. Hope was weaponized, used to keep the population compliant even as the situation became hopeless. Most insidiously, the propaganda system ensured that Germans had little access to outside information. Foreign radio broadcasts were jammed. Listening to enemy stations was punishable by imprisonment or death. Newspapers published only what the propaganda ministry approved. Letters from soldiers at the front were censored. The German population lived in an information bubble, a carefully constructed reality that bore less and less resemblance to the actual state of the war. Marguerite Hoffmann, like millions of others, had lived her entire adult life inside this bubble. She had believed what she was told because she had no access to alternatives, because questioning meant danger, because the system provided just enough truth, mixed with lies to maintain credibility. The shock of encountering reality, of seeing with her own eyes that the Americans were nothing like what she had been taught, was the shock of discovering that her entire understanding of the world was built on falsehoods. The chocolate bar was more than a treat. It was a weapon in a war of ideas, more effective than any bomb. On the fourth day, Marguerite was interviewed by an American intelligence officer, a captain with the air of someone educated, someone who had probably been a lawyer or professor before the war. Private Cohen translated. The questions were straightforward. What was her unit? What were her duties? Did she have knowledge of any SS activities? Had she witnessed war crimes? Marguerite answered honestly. She had been a signals operator. She had decoded messages. She had filed reports. She had seen nothing directly because her work kept her behind desks and radio equipment, far from the front lines and the darker aspects of the war. The captain made notes, asked a few follow-up questions, and seemed satisfied. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "What do you plan to do now? After this is all over?" Marguerite looked at him blankly. I don't know. I haven't thought about it." "Well," the captain said through Cohen's translation, "you're young. You speak German and some English, you have technical training. That'll be valuable in the post-war world. You should think about it. Think about what kind of Germany you want to help build when this is over." The presumption in that statement, the assumption that she would be part of building anything, that there would be a future beyond defeat and occupation, caught her completely off guard. "You think there will be a Germany to rebuild?" she asked quietly. The captain looked at her with something approaching sympathy. "Of course there will. Germany's not going anywhere. Its government, its military, its ideology, those are finished. But the country, the people, they'll still be there. And somebody's going to have to figure out what comes next. Might as well be people who learn something from all this." After the interview ended, Marguerite sat outside the tent and thought about that question. What did she want? For 12 years, her wants had been dictated by the state: serve the Reich, support the Führer, sacrifice for the Volk. Personal desires were subordinated to collective goals. But now the Reich was gone, the Führer was dead or dying, and the Volk were scattered, starving, defeated. What remained? She thought about her family. Her mother was probably still alive somewhere in Munich, if Munich still existed. Her father might have survived, though he'd been pressed into Volkssturm service in the final months, despite being 63 and half blind. Her sister had married an SS officer and moved to Poland during the occupation. Marguerite had no idea what had become of her. The future was a blank, terrifying in its openness, but there was something else too, something emerging from the shock and confusion. Curiosity. She wanted to know the truth. She wanted to understand how the war had really unfolded, what had actually happened in the places propaganda had concealed. She wanted to know what America was really like, this country that could field armies of such staggering size while feeding prisoners chocolate. She wanted to read books that hadn't been approved by the propaganda ministry, hear music that hadn't been vetted for ideological purity, think thoughts that didn't have to align with party doctrine. She wanted, she realized, to be free. Not in the abstract, nationalistic sense that Nazi propaganda had glorified freedom of the Volk from Jewish conspiracy or Bolshevik threat, but personal freedom. The freedom to question. The freedom to doubt. The freedom to change her mind without fear. The freedom to taste chocolate without it being a political statement. That evening, she approached Private Cohen during his rounds. "May I ask you something?" she said in halting German. "Sure," he replied. "What's on your mind?" "In America," she began slowly, "do people really have enough food? Or is this just because you're an army? Is it different for civilians?" Cohen laughed, not unkindly. "Ma'am, even during the Depression, and that was bad, real bad, most Americans didn't starve. We had bread lines, yeah, but we had bread. Now during the war, there's rationing, sure. People can't buy as much sugar or meat as they want. But nobody's eating grass soup. Nobody's kids are starving in the streets. And honestly," he gestured around at the camp, at the supplies, at the abundance, "this is just normal for us. We're not even trying that hard. This is just what happens when you've got factories that never got bombed, farms that never got burned, and a government that doesn't steal half of everything for its own corruption." "But the photographs," Marguerite said. "The ones from the 1930s, the bread lines, the poverty." "Real," Cohen acknowledged. "The Depression was real. Lot of people suffered. But you know what else was real? We fixed it. Roosevelt, the New Deal, government programs. We didn't start a war to solve our economic problems. We actually fixed the problems. And yeah, the war helped with jobs and production, but we were already recovering before that. Your propaganda showed you our worst moment and pretended that was all we were. They lied to you. About everything." Marguerite absorbed this. "And the different peoples? The races? They said America would collapse because of mixing, because of..." She trailed off, unsure how to phrase it without repeating propaganda. Cohen's expression darkened. It's complicated, he admitted. We're not perfect. There's racism, segregation, a lot of ugliness we need to fix. But you know what we don't have? We don't have camps where we murder people for their religion or ethnicity. We don't have a government that officially declares some citizens subhuman. We argue, we fight about it, sometimes it gets violent, but we don't make it systematic policy to exterminate anyone who doesn't fit a racial ideal. That's the difference. We've got problems, but we're allowed to admit they're problems and try to fix them. Can you say that about your government? The question hung in the air. Marguerite said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had heard whispers, of course rumors about camps in the East, about mass deportations, about things done to Jews and Slavs in Romany that defied comprehension. Most Germans claimed ignorance, and perhaps most truly were ignorant of the full scope. But everyone knew something. Everyone had seen the Jewish neighbors disappear, the synagogues burned, the propaganda that dehumanized entire peoples. Everyone had chosen not to ask too many questions. I didn't know, she whispered. I mean, I knew. Something. But not. Yeah, Cohen said quietly. A lot of people are going to say that in the next few months. A lot of people are going to discover what their government did in their name. And you're going to have to decide what you do with that knowledge. Whether you hide from it or face it. Whether you rebuild or just forget. That's not my choice to make. That's yours. The transformation of German POW's perceptions upon encountering American forces was documented by numerous historians and first-hand accounts. Many prisoners experienced profound cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda and observed reality. The abundance of American supplies, the endless streams of trucks, the casual wastefulness, the evident industrial superiority contradicted years of being told that Germany was winning, that the Allies were desperate, that victory was inevitable, for female auxiliaries like Marguerite. The psychological impact was often even more profound. Many had joined Wehrmacht support services out of genuine patriotic conviction, believing in the National Socialist project. They had sacrificed comfort, safety, and personal futures for the Reich, discovering that their sacrifices had been based on lies and served monstrous ends, created an existential crisis that some never fully resolved. Post-war interviews with German women who served in auxiliary roles revealed common themes. Shock at American abundance, shame at having believed propaganda, confusion about how to reconcile their wartime service with post-war reality. Some became ardent Democrats, dedicating themselves to preventing any resurgence of fascism. Others retreated into private life, refusing to discuss the war. A few remained unrepentant, convinced that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. That the ideology was sound even if the execution failed. The American policy of feeding and treating German POWs well was controversial among some Allied soldiers, particularly those who had liberated concentration camps and seen the depths of Nazi atrocities. Why are we giving them chocolate when they starved millions? Was a common complaint. But military leadership understood that proper POW treatment served strategic purposes. It encouraged surrenders, eased occupation administration, and demonstrated the superiority of democratic values over fascist brutality. Moreover, there was a pragmatic understanding that post-war Germany would need to be rebuilt, and that required German cooperation. Treating prisoners with dignity was an investment in future peace. It communicated that Allied opposition was to Nazism, not to Germans as a people, a distinction crucial for denazification efforts and eventual reconciliation. The chocolate bar, in this context, was psychological warfare of the subtlest kind. It said, your leaders told you we were barbaric, but we feed our enemies. We follow rules even in war. We have so much abundance we can afford generosity. This is what your system failed to provide. This is what ours can offer, for someone like Marguerite Hoffmann. That message was devastating, not because it threatened violence, but because it offered hope and demanded reconsideration of everything she thought she knew. The POW processing concluded after a week. Marguerite and the other women from her unit were transferred to a larger, temporary camp where they would await further classification and eventual repatriation. The journey took them through the Ruhr Valley, through landscapes of devastation that made even the hardened Wehrmacht veterans fall silent. Cities that Marguerite had known, Dortmund, Essen, Duisburg, were rubble. Not damaged, not scarred, but fundamentally erased. Entire neighborhoods reduced to broken brick and twisted steel. Factories that had once powered the German war machine now stood as empty shells. Roofs collapsed, walls blown out, machinery ruined. The roads were clogged with refugees, millions of displaced persons. German civilians fleeing the Soviet advance from the east, trudging westward with whatever possessions they could carry. Marguerite stared out through the truck's canvas covering and felt the full weight of defeat settle over her. This was what the war had brought. This was the glorious future promised by the Reich. Not conquest and Lebensraum, but destruction and displacement. Not racial purity and national greatness, but refugees and ruins dotted the new camp. The routines were similar: roll calls, interviews, rations distributed with mechanical efficiency. But the scale was larger, the organization more permanent. This wasn't a temporary processing center, but a transition facility where prisoners would remain for weeks or months while the Allies figured out how to manage millions of defeated enemy combatants. The food continued. The abundance continued. And gradually, as shock gave way to routine, Marguerite noticed something else. The Americans were already looking forward. They weren't dwelling on revenge or punishment. They were focused on logistics, on organization, on the massive task of reconstruction that lay ahead. They spoke casually about rebuilding Germany, about establishing democratic institutions, about trials for major war criminals, but amnesty for ordinary soldiers. They weren't angels. Marguerite heard American soldiers express plenty of contempt for Germans, saw instances of harsh treatment, witnessed the casual racism some Americans directed toward black troops. But the overall system, the overarching policy, was oriented toward practical outcomes rather than emotional retribution. Private Cohen, who had been reassigned to the larger camp, continued his informal English lessons. A dozen German prisoners gathered each evening to learn basic phrases, partly to ease communication, partly because it gave them something to do besides dwell on their circumstances. Cohen was patient, correcting pronunciation without mockery, explaining grammar with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. One evening, he brought a stack of American magazines, Life Saturday Evening Post, National Geographic, that had been donated for educational purposes. The prisoners crowded around, staring at the photographs with fascination. American cities, intact and gleaming. Farms with enormous mechanized harvesters. Factories producing cars and refrigerators. Families gathered around dinner tables laden with food. Advertisements for products most Germans had never heard of, luxury so common in America, they needed to create demand through marketing. Is this real? One of the German soldiers asked, pointing to an advertisement showing a fully stocked supermarket. Or propaganda? Cohen laughed. It's advertising, so yeah, it's a little exaggerated. But basically real. That's a normal grocery store. That's what people shop in, even during the war. Marguerite asked. Even during the war? Like I said, there's rationing. You can't buy unlimited amounts of everything. But the shelves aren't empty. You just need ration stamps for certain things. The Germans exchanged looks of disbelief. One of the older Wehrmacht officers shook his head slowly. We were told you were starving. That your cities were in chaos. That your people were on the verge of revolution. Nope, Cohen said cheerfully. Don't get me wrong. People are tired of the war, eager for it to be over. But starving? Chaos? Not even close. Our factories are running 3 shifts. Our farms are producing record harvests. We're building ships faster than your U-boats could sink them. Planes faster than your flak could shoot them down. That's why you lost. Not because we're better soldiers, though we're pretty damn good, but because we had more of everything. More food, more fuel, more steel, more bullets. And that came from a system that works, that doesn't eat itself from the inside like yours did. It was a harsh assessment, but delivered without malice. Just facts. The German prisoners absorbed it in silence, each processing the implications in their own way. That night, Marguerite lay awake thinking about systems. The National Socialist system had promised strength through unity, prosperity through conquest, greatness through racial purity. It had delivered war, scarcity, and catastrophic defeat. The American system, which German propaganda had endlessly mocked as weak, divided, decadent, had produced enough abundance to wage war on two continents simultaneously, while maintaining civilian prosperity and even feeding its enemies. Perhaps, she thought, freedom wasn't weakness. Perhaps diversity wasn't decay. Perhaps democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, actually worked better than dictatorship. It was a heretical thought, one that would have gotten her arrested a month earlier. Now it seemed like simple observation. The chocolate bar wrapper still sat among her few possessions, a talisman of this new understanding. She had kept it, though she couldn't fully articulate why. Maybe as evidence. Maybe as reminder. Maybe because it represented something she wanted to believe in, the possibility of a world where abundance was shared, where rules applied to everyone, where even enemies could be treated with dignity. Years later, when historians interviewed Marguerite Hoffman about her wartime experiences, she would struggle to explain the precise moment when her worldview shifted. It wasn't a single event, she said, but an accumulation of small contradictions between what she had been taught and what she observed. The food was part of it. The casual efficiency of American logistics was part of it. The absence of systematic cruelty was part of it. But more than anything, it was the sense that the Americans were already thinking about the future, while the Reich had been obsessed with the past. Nazi ideology had constantly invoked Germanic myths, ancient glory, blood and soil, and ancestral purity. It looked backward, seeking to reclaim some imagined golden age. American ideology, for all its own contradictions and injustices, looked forward. It was built on the idea of progress, of making things better, of each generation having more opportunity than the last. That forward orientation, that optimism, was built into the system in ways that produced tangible results: innovation, industrial growth, and yes, the capacity to feed prisoners chocolate in the midst of total war. Marguerite would spend the rest of her life grappling with what she had been part of, what she had believed, what she had failed to question. She would learn about the camps, not the POW camps but the death camps, the systematic murder of millions. She would read testimony from survivors, see photographs from Auschwitz and Treblinka, and feel a shame so deep it never fully faded. She would ask herself the terrible questions. What could I have done? Should I have known? Am I guilty? There were no easy answers. She had been a signals operator, far from the killing, unaware of the full scope. But she had been part of the machine. She had believed the propaganda. She had supported the regime. The chocolate bar represented not just American abundance, but her own complicity. The ease with which she had been manipulated. The willingness to believe comforting lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. But it also represented the possibility of change. If she could be wrong about the Americans completely, utterly wrong, then she could change her understanding. She could learn. She could build something different from the ruins of the Reich. After repatriation in late 1945, Marguerite returned to Munich and found it as devastated as the Ruhr. Her mother had survived, living in a basement apartment with 3 other families, scraping by on rations and Allied aid. Her father was dead, killed in the final weeks defending a bridge that no longer mattered. Her sister was missing, last seen fleeing westward from Poland ahead of Soviet forces. Status unknown. Marguerite got a job with the Allied Occupation Administration, using her language skills and technical training to assist with reconstruction logistics. She translated documents, coordinated supply distributions, helped organize the machinery of recovery. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was purposeful. She was building something instead of destroying it. She also bore witness. When the Nuremberg trials began, she followed the proceedings obsessively, reading every transcript she could access, forcing herself to confront the full documentation of what the Reich had done. It was excruciating. But she believed she owed it to the victims, to history, to herself to know and acknowledge the truth. In 1948, during the Berlin airlift, Marguerite volunteered to help coordinate supply deliveries. She worked 18-hour days helping track the endless stream of Allied Cargo planes bringing food and fuel to the blockaded city. Once again, she was confronted with American abundance, the sheer logistical miracle of supplying an entire city by air for months. Something that would have been unthinkable for the Reich even at the height of its power. The airlift succeeded where the blockade failed. Not through military force, but through systematic, stubborn generosity. She thought often about Private Cohen, about Sergeant Harrison, about the nameless American soldiers who had treated her with casual dignity when they could have been cruel. She wondered if they knew, if they understood the impact their small kindnesses had. Probably not. For them, it had just been following orders, doing their jobs. For her, it had been a revelation. Democracy, it turned out, wasn't a weakness. It was a different kind of strength, not the brittle, rigid strength of enforced conformity, but the flexible, resilient strength of systems that could absorb dissent, adapt to change, and correct their own errors. It was slower, messier, more chaotic than dictatorship. But it was also more durable, more humane, more capable of learning. The abundance that had so shocked Marguerite wasn't just material. It was an abundance of ideas, of possibilities, of futures. The American soldiers who fed German prisoners weren't soft or weak. They were confident enough to extend mercy because they knew they had won not just militarily but ideologically.